Alrighty, I'm back. It's been a few days. It's been very nice not thinking about anything to do with current events and politics, just kind of trying to enjoy the holiday. It was stressful anyway, but, not for political reasons. I got that crap out of my mind, but it's Sunday. We're a couple days removed from Thanksgiving now. It's time to get back to business, and there's a lot of action brewing in China. What I'll say offhand, I've seen this come and go in places like China, including China. There's this supposed uprising. You see all these videos of people in the streets. You see them, breaking shit and knocking over phone booths, setting cars on fire. And you think, wow, things are really going down in X country. I bet there's going to be regime change. And then fast forward a few months, and all of a sudden you don't see me putting out any videos talking about, X country anymore, and we're on to the next thing. And you look at that country today, and almost invariably nothing has changed. Whether it's Belarus, Iran, France. I mean, the yellow vests were that was the most remarkable thing. Absolutely nothing came of it. And so that's why I've become very, very cynical about the idea of protesting. I've never been someone who's ever been to a protest anyway. It's just not really in my nature. I find it strange. It would never occur to me if I was upset at a politician to just, go out and, block a road with some signs and try and stop people from getting to work on time because I was angry at a politician. The two things have never really gone together, although there have been protests that I've certainly been sympathetic towards, like the yellow vests. And even in, Iran and maybe even Belarus, even though I think the Belarus protests were pretty well astroturfed, and they were just a bunch of, woke college kids. I do sympathize with people who don't like politicians, because generally I have a reason to hate pretty much every politician on earth, whether they be Iranian, Chinese, French, Belarusian, American, Canadian. Oh, hell, remember the big trucker uprising in Canada? I mean, that was a big deal. I mean, there was a lot of, by Canadian standards, that was a full-on revolution. Nothing came of it. In fact, they locked up the leaders, put them in prison. They froze people's bank accounts simply for giving money to buy food for these people. And so if protests have absolutely zero impact in supposedly, now I don't believe this, but what we're told are the free, good Western nations like France or Canada, if protests are absolutely meaningless there, even if they're mass and they mobilize however many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, if these protests won't even cause Western leaders who supposedly claim, oh, we work for the people, that's what Western leaders tell us, if they don't even flinch, if they don't even question what they're doing, if they don't even feel the need to dignify the protesters with a response or to address them at all, they just completely ignore them, how do you think that the same sort of protests are going to go over in a place like China? The Chinese, obviously, are rioting because they're tired of being locked up. And frankly, I said that the BLM riots, the George Floyd riots back in 2020, I thought that they were more about lockdowns than they were about any sort of racial stuff. I think it was in all these big blue cities, people were tired of being locked up in their house, and so they wanted to go out and have some fun. And, what could be more fun than a riot? And so that's what you're seeing in China right now. Across the country, we're seeing videos in many cities. But somebody on Twitter, and who was it that I saw say this in particular? Maybe it was Election Wizard. They pointed out correctly that when you're seeing videos come out of China, more often than not, you're seeing what the CCP wants you to see. So back in 2020, if you remember, we saw all these terrible videos of what was going on in China and how bad the virus was. And we were hearing these stories about how the crematoriums were running 24 hours a day, and you could see the smoke billowing. It never stopped because they just kept having to burn and burn more and more bodies, because, of course, you can't actually have a burial in China. You have to be cremated. Burying your dead, I mean, that's just bourgeois decadence. And we were seeing videos of the Chinese authorities literally weld people into their apartments because they have steel doors, because it's just a Orwellian nightmare state over in China. They put people in these Stalinist apartment blocks with metal doors that they can weld shut if people act up, and that's what we were seeing. And you know what? That scared the West so much that they were willing to accept the exact same treatment. They said, wow, this virus, it must be really, really bad. And people fell victim to hysteria. Many, many, many people in the West are still consumed by this hysteria. To this day, there are family members that I have not seen since Christmas of 2019. Because they're scared to death to leave their house and they won't allow any visitors. I don't even know if they're alive. Now, thankfully, most of my family, is the exact opposite. And in fact, I didn't participate in this, but some of my family at holidays have started a tradition of taking shots of ivermectin, just I guess as a troll. But either way, I think that if we look back at 2020 and a lot of what came out of China, we could correctly suppose, in hindsight, that this was, that this footage, the supposed, leaked footage out of China that wasn't supposed to get out, was probably selectively allowed to pass through the Great Firewall of China by the CCP as a part of a propaganda effort. And so, if the CCP is choosing to show us these protests, if indeed they are choosing it, why is that? Is it perhaps that the CCP wants to falsely convey that they are weaker than they actually are? Are they trying to bait Western intelligence agencies, perhaps, into showing their hand? I don't know, frankly. I could be completely off base here. These all could be 100%. I mean, I'm not saying that the videos are staged. Let me be clear. Okay? I'll pull a page out of Obama's book. I'm going to make it clear. These videos I don't think they're staged. What I'm saying is that the videos that we're being allowed to see are curated, and they're being released for a particular purpose. They're being allowed to circulate. Or it could just be that the Chinese censorship regime is not impervious, and that when there is something that is truly this massive and undeniable, that even the Chinese cannot censor it and suppress it. And if and that is indeed the case, if this truly is just such a momentous wave of riots across China that the CCP is unable to contain the news about it, well, does it matter? Is this going to change the CCP? Is this going to lead to their downfall? My guess is probably not. But I would say that you could make the argument that in China, because there is not this democratic, pseudo-democratic, because I don't want to overstate the glory of Western political systems, there's not this pseudo-democratic pressure release valve in the form of elections. The people of Canada, the people of France, they do still have elections, and that creates these glimmers of hope for the opposition, for dissidents. They think, you know what? We don't necessarily have to overthrow the regime. We just have to win the next election. And that keeps people somewhat contained. And it limits the potential support for revolutionary movements, because a substantial portion of the population in the West, no matter how much they hate the regime, or no matter how much they hate who's currently in power, they hang on to this fantasy that they can somehow choose a different leader the next time around, and that things can be different. In China, they don't have that illusion to overcome. Everyone understands that the CCP is in charge, and they always will be unless they are brought down by force. And so because of that, the population overall in China, of dissidents, to the extent that they exist at all, is starting from a much more desperate position to begin with than Western dissidents. There is not this fantasy that, hey, if you remain peaceful, you can still change the government at some later date. The Chinese have no hope for that. So presumably, to the extent that you are a dissident in China, you would also, by definition, support some sort of extra-constitutional revolution. And so the question becomes not how many dissidents will join the revolutionary movement, but more a question of how many dissidents actually are there. Whereas in Canada, you had plenty of, Tory party voting cucks who were against the truckers because they said, well, those truckers, they make too much noise. You see, honking your horn, that's very rude. And a respectable country doesn't do that. So we'll continue to live in bondage under Justin Trudeau because, you know what, I might not agree with him all the time, but he's my prime minister because I voted in an election. You're not going to have that to the same extent in China. You're going to have people who support the party and who believe in what they're doing, and you're going to have people who disagree with the party and want them overthrown. So with that said, do I still think that they have any chance? No, not at this point. Things would have to get much, much worse in China, which you say, well, how could they get any worse? Worse for the CCP in terms of people turning on them. And at that point, I think that the CCP, rather than lose power, probably would relent to a certain extent. I think that they would respond at that point, not directly, but they would decide, you know what, we've been doing this for a while, and we think we did a good job, and so we're going to declare mission accomplished, and here, you don't have to have your QR code. You still have to have your QR code, but we're not going to make you get your PCR test every day. See, that's how they'll do it. They'll start scaling it back a little bit, but they'll never get rid of all of it. And so then from now on in China, you'll always have your QR code that you have to present, but it might not be such a burden. It might not be so taxing on the individual Chinese citizen to deal with that QR code, because the QR code will just always be green until all of a sudden one day it's not, and they take you away and put you in a gulag because you said something nasty about Winnie the Pooh on WeChat. Now, this might not be such a popular opinion that I'm expressing today, the doomerism, but I don't mean to be a doomer. I don't want to say that anything is impossible, but the odds are always stacked against you in this kind of a situation. But there is always a point in which regimes reach an inflection point where they begin to decline and eventually collapse. All regimes end eventually. Of course, more often than not, they're replaced with worse ones. The old, decrepit Chinese imperial Qing dynasty gave way to the warlord period in China, and the warlord period gave way to communism in 1949. So China has a long history now. Maybe not as long as the arc of Chinese history, and I think probably people in China, are much more historically minded than Americans, certainly. To Americans, history begins in 1776. Chinese history goes back thousands of years, so maybe 100 and so years of, well, more than that, a couple hundred years of what I would consider to be pretty bad times in China, pretty bad governance in China. That's just a blink of an eye to a lot of Chinese people. And so even if they do dissent against the current regime, they might be hopeful for the future. I mean, that's why they have the whole concept of the mandate of heaven. I don't know how much that concept really still plays into the Chinese political psyche. I'm sure they don't believe it literally anymore, for the most part, but they might still, at a certain level, it might be ingrained in them to the extent of, hey, regimes are legitimate when things go well. And when things aren't going well, that regime isn't legitimate and it needs to be replaced. That was the history of Chinese politics for thousands of years. And I think the CCP has been operating under a modernized mandate of heaven sort of bargain, going back to the days of, what was his name? Deng Xiaoping, when he started modernizing China, opening it up to economic expansion, and the Chinese economy has expanded rapidly, and a lot of people have gotten really rich in China. So we'll have to see where this goes, but I think that the CCP still has a lot of life left in it. That's where I'll leave that. So I will see you folks back here tomorrow. I am now back on schedule.